Are you ready to get really good at texture baking in Blender? Texture baking is a technique used in 3D to turn our material shader node setups into textures. This allows us to then take our textures into other 3D software, like game engines, which unfortunately is something we can't do with shader nodes alone. This is because every 3D software uses slightly different shader nodes, so they won't be able to translate over easily when converting from Blender to the other 3D software. However, pretty much all softwares will work with textures, as they are just images with information used to power our shaders. We can also use our texture bakes inside of Blender to speed up our own render times. Whereas if we were to just use a procedural material with a million nodes, we will have a slightly longer render time, or sometimes a very significant one. So texture baking can really help here. Also, since you can texture bake pretty much anything, this works great for us as 3D artists. In this course, I will be walking you through the entire PBR texture baking workflow to turn your procedural materials or other shader node setups into image textures so you can then use them in other 3D software or to speed up your render times in Blender, as I mentioned earlier. I will also be giving you some of my premium procedural materials for free so you can follow along with this course using quality examples even if you haven't made your own procedural materials. Of course though, the skills you will learn in this course will still apply to any procedural material or shader node setup that you choose to make. First though, I need to mention some important information that you will need to know before following this free course. For example, if you're new to texturing and materials in Blender, I highly recommend sharpening up your skills in this area first, and if you want a simple way to do that, you can check out my free Texture Basics course here on YouTube in the description, and even just following a little bit of that course should give you a good bit of foundational knowledge to get the hang of materials in Blender. It also gives you a good bit of knowledge on different types of texture maps, which we'll be covering a little bit in this course, as we'll be baking our shader nodes into some texture maps. Once you've got some decent texturing and shader node knowledge, you should be good to go. But you can also follow my old Texture Baking for Beginners course if you want to give yourself a little head start on what we will be covering in this course. Link to both of these are in the description, but the first one is the most important for new Blender users. Are you ready to learn the PBR texture baking workflow used to turn procedural material shader node setups into textures? Welcome to the first episode in the Texture Baking Mastery course. Today we're going to be starting off simple and we're just going to do a full PBR bake for this procedural marble material which I made. It is a paid asset, but I'm releasing it free for you guys so you can follow along with this course, as I want to make sure you guys are working with some of my best stuff while you're learning. So to get started, just click the download link in the description below. Then all you're going to need to do is open your file browser. So I'm going to right click my marble.zip, and then where it says extract all, I'm just going to left click that, and here it's going to say select a destination folder. So you can choose a particular folder if you want to put your marble material into that folder, but I'm just going to keep it in this one and just press extract. And when it's done, we'll have a folder called marble, and if I double click this to open it, there'll be yet another folder called marble, and then you'll have your marble.blend, and that's what's going to actually contain our material. So I'm going to switch back to Blender now. And so some of you probably know how to do this, but we need to now import the Blender material into our Blender file. And we do that with something called the append in Blender. So I'm going to left click file, and then I'm going to choose append. Then I've just navigated to where I've extracted my marble material, which I've just contained within my Blender projects, but for you, if you've just done it from your downloads, it'll just be in your downloads folder. Also, if you want these big icons like I have, you can change your icon type here in the top right hand corner. You can see I can make this more like a list, or I can make it a little bit bigger, or I can choose these big thumbnails like this. There's even more adjustment you can do if you left click this arrow here, and you can see you can change the size and things like that here. With that tangent out of the way, I'm just going to double click the marble folder, and there's another marble folder, and here you can see our marble material. So I'm just going to left click that, and now when we press this append button, it's going to open up another menu, and the one we're looking for is material because we only need to add the material. So I'm going to double click the material folder and then left click marble and choose append. Now, a quick important thing to remember when you're appending a material or some kind of data slot, so that could be like another type of node setup like geometry nodes for example, is we need to now assign it to something before we close our Blender file, because if we close our Blender file now, it's going to delete that material which we just imported and we'd have to import it all over again. So let's assign it to an object. Since we're just going to be baking onto a cube today, I'm just going to press Shift and then A to open the add menu, then under mesh, I'm going to choose cube. Then I'm going to come down to my timeline here, or this clock icon, and I'm just going to left click it and change it to the shader editor. This should all be pretty simple to you at this point. And also we're going to make sure that this option here is set to object, as sometimes in Blender 4.2 it seems to set to line style by default, So I'm just going to make sure I'm in the object option here. And here, rather than pressing plus new to add a new material, I'm going to left click this drop down here. And here you can see our marble material has been added, so I'm just going to left click it. We can't see it just now, but an easy way to fix this is I can just press A with my mouse in this menu here, and that's going to select all of my nodes, even if we can't see them. And then I'm going to left click this view option, and then choose frame selected. And there we go, it's now brought all our nodes into view. And you can see that we've added a nice node here, which has got all of our parameters which we can control. But of course, if I change any of these parameters just now, you're not going to be able to see anything because we're not in the material preview mode. So I'm just going to come to the top here and change to material preview by left clicking this button. If you're in Blender 4.1 or earlier, your material should show just fine, but because we're in Blender 4.2, there is a few issues which we need to fix first. So first of all, I'm going to come up to my render properties panel, and here I'm going to make sure I'm in Eevee. Even though baking occurs in cycles, this is more just an issue in Blender 4.2 that we need to fix, so we need to go into Eevee first. And I'm just going to come down to ray tracing and left click it to enable it, and I'm going to change my max roughness to 1. Now if I zoom in, you can see our marble is working much better now. This node setup I've made has made it so we can easily tweak any of these settings. So for example, if I wanted to change the color of the marble, I could change it here. For example, I can maybe make this a much more white marble. That looks quite good like that, so I'm just going to keep it at this color. You can also adjust the scale. This will scale the entire material, so you can see I can make it bigger or smaller very easily. I'm maybe going to set it to a value of 0.75. Then we have the background pattern scale, and this is just going to scale the pattern underneath. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that scale. Cracks brightness will control the brightness of these cracks here. Crack scale will just adjust the size of these cracks. Roughness strength relates to the reflections, so if I increase this, you can see it's going to get slightly less clearer reflections. I'll maybe set it to something a little less reflective, like maybe 0.1. Scale roughness is because I'm using some roughness imperfections using a noise texture. All that scale roughness is going to do is change the size of those imperfections. To show you what those imperfections look like, I'm just going to left click this node button here to go into the node tree, and I'm going to move along to where our principal BSDF is, and where it says roughness, I'm just going to follow that noodle, which is just that line, and here you can see I've got the roughness node set up here. You can see it's using a noise texture which has been edited a little bit with a few nodes, and if I just left click and drag this value here and plug it into marble shader, which is our output in this case, you can see this is what our roughness imperfections look like. I'll set it back to the default, so I'll just plug this BSDF back in the marble shader. So yeah, I thought I'd just give you a quick run through of how this shader works, just to kind of build some familiarity. So of course you're probably more used to, like in the last course, baking just nodes like this rather than a big node setup like we have here. But honestly, there's not too much difference. The only thing this node group is doing is kind of organizing things to make it a little bit easier to use. But the baking process will still be the same. Pretty much what it's going to do is it's going to look at this shader when I'm baking. And let's say, for example, if I wanted to bake the base color, it's going to look at this node setup here, and then it's going to look at the shader that's attached here. And then it's going to see the base color of this, and that's what it's going to bake as the diffuse map or base color map. The same would apply, of course, for the roughness and the emission and things like that for baking height and stuff as well. You will notice this marble shader here doesn't have any bump or normal or anything like that. So today we won't have to bake any height or anything like that. Also, if you're wondering what this UV or object is, this is just an easy switch to control the coordinates this shader uses. It's not really too relevant for this tutorial, but you can see if I switch it to 1, it's now going to use the default cube UV coordinates, and so that might affect the scale. I'm going to switch it back to 0, which is object, which is best for these kind of procedural materials. Awesome. Let's go ahead and start baking. So to start off, we're going to need a nice UV. So I'm going to come up to the top left hand corner where the little cross shape will appear, and then I'm going to left click and drag, and you can see that's pulled out another window. Then I'm going to change my menu here, so I'm going to come up to the top left hand corner, and I'm going to change my editor type here to UV editor. Right now we can't see our UV, which is normal because we need to be in edit mode. So I'm going to bring my mouse back over to where my object is, and I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode. It'll have everything selected by default, which is why we can see our UV, but if you can't see this entire cross shape, then you can just press A in this menu here, and that's going to make sure everything's selected. Notice how if I left click to select away, that we can't see anything in our UV editor. So I'm going to bring my mouse over here again and just press A to select everything. So this cross shape is our default UV, and if you followed along with the beginner's UV unwrapping course, you will know that this cross shape isn't actually the optimal UV unwrap for a cube when you're doing texture baking and texture painting. Rather, for these two processes, in our case texture baking, we're going to want to optimize our texture space a little bit more using something called a Smart UV project. This is a pretty small optimization, but it's still something that can be worth doing, especially if you're going to be using a project with a lot of assets. And I always like to use the most optimal way if possible. That's not to say you might want to use Smart UV Project for all types of objects, as some might be better off with a seam based UV unwrap, which this cross would be example of. I'm not going to dive too much more into UV unwrapping for now though, because the focus of this tutorial is to get us started with more texture baking. So I'm going to press A to select everything in here, and then I'm going to press U, which will open the UV unwrapping menu. Then I can just choose this Smart UV Project option, and here a bunch of settings will appear. I'm just going to keep it at the default apart from island margin, which I'm going to set to 0.01. Then I'm going to choose unwrap. Here in the bottom left hand corner, you'll see that we can edit all of these settings that we've made, and you can see that it's set our squares like this, and these squares will be slightly bigger, meaning that we get more of our detail preserved in our texture bakes. This is good because that way, no matter what texture resolution we go for example 4K or 2K, we'll be getting the max amount of detail packed into our texture, since we're using the maximum size of squares for our faces of our cube. But with that talk on optimizations out of the way, let's move on to the actual texture baking process. So we've got our UV, which is going to now decide how this texture is going to be baked. Let's go ahead and add an image texture to bake onto. So I'll come to my shader node window here, and I'm just going to make some space by left clicking and dragging my nodes. And I'll press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture. If you like, you can also come up to the top here and change from edit mode to object mode, but it's totally up to you. Then we're going to be baking the base color first, so I'm going to left click plus new, and you can either call this diffuse or base color. I'm just going to call it diffuse, and then I'll call it marble. And then usually I like to label what type of resolution this is. So you can just put in maybe 2K, since I'm going to make this 2K, which is just pretty much 2000 pixels more or less. But since this is your texture bake, you can label this however you like, but having a nice descriptive name, especially if you're planning on selling your texture bakes, for example, alongside a 3D model. Then for the width and height, I'm going to use a cool trick to quickly double this to make it 2K. So I'm going to left click and then quickly drag down. You can see that's going to highlight both of our numbers. If you're struggling to do this, you can just do this one at a time instead. I'm then going to press the right arrow on my keyboard, and that's going to bring my typer here to the end. And then I can just hold down the Shift key and press the 8 key on the keyboard, and that's going to create an asterisk or a times symbol. And then we can type in the number 2 and press enter, and that's going to perform the math operation of just timesing that by 2, which gives us a 2K texture. Color we can just leave at the default, all of these we can leave at default, and then I can just press new image. I'm going to keep my color space on sRGB since this is going to be a base color map, and now we have this ready to go. Then I'm going to set up our bake settings. So we'll come up to our render properties here, and I'm going to change my render engine from Eevee to cycles, since as you probably know, texture baking always occurs in cycles. Then you'll see we have some sampling here, and there's viewport and render sampling. Render sampling is the only one we need to concern ourselves with for texture baking. So I'm going to change my max samples to something low like 10. You only really need to set this higher if you're baking something which uses lighting, for example ambient occlusion or a light map. Then I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here, and where it says bake, I'm just going to left click to open this tab, and I'm going to change my bake type here from combined to diffuse. Remember, diffuse is pretty much just the same as base color. Then under influence, it's important that we turn off this indirect and direct options. Direct and indirect are just like the lights in your scene and things like that. And all we want is the color that's been inputted into our principled BSDF shader inside of our node group. You might be wondering if we need to bake both of these colors separately, but no, these parameters here, if I go inside my node group here by left clicking this node tree button, are just inputs from here which we can edit using the node tree. But all that's important for the texture baking is what's going into this base color slot on our principled BSDF. I'll press this arrow to come back up. You'll also notice we have a setting here called margin. This will just create some extra baking around our empty space on our UV to make sure there's no detail being lost. Then we need to left click our image texture here, and then we can just go ahead and press bake. Awesome. So our progress bar is completed, and you can see that our texture bake has now been put on top of our UV, and if I zoom out here, you can see it in its full glory. I'm going to want to create a new cube to test our texture bakes as we go, but before I do that, I want to make sure I save my image texture just in case Blender crashes. So I'm going to press Ctrl S first, and that's going to save my blend file. You can also press file and choose save as well. Then where it says image here, you can see there's an asterisk beside it, which just means it needs to be saved. So I'm going to left click that, and then I'm going to choose save. Then I'm going to find a suitable location on my computer where I want to save my texture bakes, and I might create a new folder by just pressing this plus folder button, and I'm going to call this one marble 2K textures. And I'll just press enter. Then I'll double click it to open it, and here I'm just going to save as image here, and now our image should be safe. Just keep in mind, if you bake on top of your diffuse marble 2K again, you will need to come to image and then choose save, but you won't need to choose a location now. It'll always be in the same location. Of course though, if you wanted to save a duplicate of this texture, you could choose save as and save it in a second location. Alright, let's go ahead and try out our new texture bake. So I'm going to left click my cube, press Shift D to duplicate it, and then I'm going to press G and Y to move my cube along, and just left click. Now because we duplicated this, it means it's going to be using the same UV, which means that our diffuse marble will work just fine. So I'm going to remove this material since we're going to create a new one. So I'm just going to press X to unlink data, and you can see that's now created a blank cube for me. Then I'll press plus new to add a new material. I'm just going to name this one by left clicking material.001, and I'm just going to call it marble baked. You can see we've lost our nodes again, so all we can do is just press A to select everything inside of our shader node menu. Then where it says view, I'm just going to go to frame selected. Now let's press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture. Another thing we'll need is we want to use the UV coordinates. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under input, I'm going to choose texture coordinate. And since we're using a UV map for our texture bakes, as always, we're just going to use the UV coordinates and plug that into our texture. If I plug this into the color, right now it's just going to be null because we don't actually have anything in it. So I can just choose this drop down here, and here I can choose one of the image textures in my Blender file. If you're doing this in a separate Blender file, you could just press open, find your diffuse marble texture and open it that way. Just make sure you've got an object with the same UV unwrap. Then I'll choose my diffuse marble 2K, and now you can see it's been baked successfully. But we still have to do the reflections and all of that nice stuff. So let's move on to that. I'll left click my other marble cube, and then I'm just going to go to view and then choose frame all. Now I can go ahead and press this X button to unlink it if you like, or you can just add a new texture by pressing Shift A. Then under texture, I'll choose image texture, and I'm going to press plus new. This time you can see we've already got it set up at 2K, which is nice. And I'm just going to call this one roughness marble, and then 2K. Then I'm just going to left click new image. Then we'll change our color space here from sRGB to non-color, since we're working with a black and white texture here. Then I'm going to come back to my bake settings. If I scroll up to the top, we can keep our render max samples at 10, since we're just baking a basic channel, in our case grayscale, and no lighting information is being used, so a nice low sample count is all we need. So I'll change our bake type then from diffuse to roughness, and with all of our margin and stuff already set up, we should be ready to just go ahead, left click our roughness marble 2K, make sure we have our object selected in the 3D viewport, and then we can just go ahead and left click bake. Awesome, now our bake is complete, and you can see in the left hand corner here, we have our roughness imperfections here. Now we'll need to do the same thing again and save our image texture, which is really important after we texture bake. So I'm going to left click this image with a star beside it and choose save. Then I'm going to come to where I've saved my diffuse marble 2K texture, and I'm just going to save my roughness marble 2K in here as well. So I'll just choose save as image, and now everything should be good to go. I'll then left click my cube with all my bakes. It looks like my nodes have disappeared again, so I'm just going to go to view and then choose frame all, and I'm just going to go ahead and left click my diffuse marble, press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm just going to bring it down underneath. I'll left click and drag just to move my marble up, and I'm going to left click this X button here since we're going to use a different texture, and we can either open it and choose it from our file browser, or since it's already in our Blender file, we can just choose our roughness marble 2K from here. You can see it's already set to non-color, but just double check to make sure it's already set to that. Then I'll plug my UV into the vector, and then I'll plug my color into the roughness channel. Now you can see we've got the reflections on this one as well. As always, you can see that this one has a little bit more detail to it, and the only way to fix that would be to baking this at a higher resolution, such as 4K. But to be honest, for this kind of object, this texture size should be fine. When choosing a texture size, it's important to consider how important the object is for your animation project or game project, and also what your budget is in terms of resources. For example, for an animation, you can render out each frame so you can get away with a little bit more detail. Whereas for a game, everything is rendered in real time, so you're going to want to make sure everything is low as possible while still preserving the look you want to achieve. That's us done for baking this marble, but I want to talk a little bit about baking gloss. Now Blender doesn't use gloss as it uses roughness instead, but if you're taking this object and its texture bakes into a different 3D software which uses gloss, it is handy to know how to bake the gloss. That way you won't have to use any nodes inside of that software, which might slightly increase your render times. So I'm going to left click my original marble, and I'm going to have to frame my nodes again. So I'm just going to press view, and then I'm going to choose frame all. And this time we're going to press Shift A, then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture, and I'm going to press plus new and choose gloss marble 2K. And we've already got the right width and height for resolution, so I'll just go ahead and press new image. Then this is also grayscale texture, so I'm going to change our color space to non-color. Great. Now how do we do this with this node group? Because it's a little bit hard to invert our roughness using this. Well, we'll have to go inside the node tree. So I'm going to zoom in, and where this node tree button is, I can just left click it to go inside. And the only thing we need to worry about in all of this mess of nodes is this noodle here. If you remember from the beginner course, a gloss map is an inverted roughness map. So all we need to do is invert this channel here, and that will give us our gloss map, which we can then use in 3D softwares which use gloss instead of roughness. So I'm going to press Shift A, and in my search bar, I'm just going to search for invert, and here you can see there's an option called invert color. And all we need to do is plug that in between these two nodes by left clicking, and you can see that's put that in place. Instantly you can see our material has become a lot less reflective, because essentially what's happened, all of the whiter areas have become grey or more reflective, and all the darker areas which were once reflective have now become more rough. And since this was a mostly reflective material, the more reflective bits have now become a little bit more rougher or less reflective. Do keep in mind that the higher contrast your roughness was originally, the higher you'll notice this effect. But you can see our invert node has been added in between it, and this is really all you need to do to invert your roughness. Just think of putting it right before the roughness input on your shader, and you should be fine to go no matter what Blender node setup you're using. I'm going to left click this arrow here to come back to the top of my node setup, and I'm going to left click my gloss marble 2K texture, and all we need to do now is come to the bake options, and we can just choose bake. The reason we don't need to change bake type is because we've already inverted our marble shader's roughness and turned it into pretty much a gloss map. So I can just go ahead and bake the roughness channel, and it's going to generate a gloss map for me because of that invert node. So I'll just left click bake with my gloss marble selected. You can see now that our gloss map has been baked, and here it is in the top left hand corner. And you can see what I was saying, how the areas which are darker on the roughness map here, if I just left click this drop down and choose roughness marble, are the lighter areas on our gloss marble. Then we just need to go ahead and save it. So I'm going to left click this image and then choose save as or save. And then in my usual folder, I can just go ahead and press save as image. And that's pretty much it. Of course, we have inverted our shader here, so if you want to go ahead and fix that, you can just left click this node tree button, and we can either delete this invert color node and plug in our value to our roughness, or if you want a lazy way to do it, you can just go ahead and left click the factor and type in the number 0, which is going to effectively turn off the invert. Awesome. Of course, if you want to use the gloss map in Blender, which in our case wouldn't make sense because we have a roughness map already, but if you did want to do it, all you need to do is get an image texture first. So I'll press Shift A, texture, I'll choose image texture, I'll left click this drop down and choose my gloss marble, plug in my UV to my vector, and before we plug it into roughness, we're going to need to invert it so it becomes roughness again. So I'll press Shift A, then under color, I'll choose invert color, plug the color of this texture into the color here. Then I can plug this color into the roughness slot, and now effectively this gloss marble and this invert color node together are pretty much the same as this roughness marble texture here. But yeah, great job. That's you gone ahead and completed your first lesson in this texture baking mastery course. This one was more of a recap of everything we learned in the last course to help keep all of your knowledge fresh and strong. Feel free to share your texture baking results in the community if you would like to, as I'd love to see how you're getting on with this course. Apart from that though, I'd like to thank you so much for watching this episode, and I'll see you in the next module. Take care. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our texture baking mastery course. Today we are going to be baking some bricks because these have some bump details, so I'm going to show you how to bake both the bump or height map and also how to bake the normal map as well. So first of all, you're going to want to download the procedural brick material in the description, and when you're done you should have something here called brick1.zip. So I'm just going to left click it, and then you can right click it, and then you can choose extract all, and that's going to turn this zip file into a folder with the blend file in it. So I'll press extract all. Here it will ask you where you want to extract the file to. So if you have a certain location where you want to save this premium procedural material, you can press browse and then choose save. Otherwise you can just extract into your downloads folder by just going ahead and pressing extract. Now back in Blender here, I'm just going to go ahead and create my object to bake onto. So I'm going to create a kind of brick wall. Press Shift A, and then under mesh I'm going to choose cube, and I'm going to press S and then X just to scale it on the X axis. I'll left click, and then I'm going to press S and then Z and scale it on the Z axis till we've got a nice wall like this. Maybe I'll make it a bit skinnier, so I'll press S and then Y, scale it down, and now we have a nice kind of wall to put our brick onto. Then we're going to want to add our material to this, so I'm going to left click and drag my timeline to pull it up, and I'm going to change the clock to the shader editor. For some reason in 4.2 it sometimes seems to put me into this line style option, so I'm just going to left click that drop down and change the object. Then we don't actually have our material in our scene yet, So what we can do is press File, and to import something from another blend file, we need to use the Append Import option. So I'll just left click Append. And if you remember, we extracted things in our downloads. So here you can see we've got our brick 1 folder. So I'll just double click that. And here you can see I've got the brick material here. So I'll just double click that. And then I'm going to choose material, and I'll just left click the brick one and then choose append. Then I can left click this drop down here and choose our brick material. Right now nothing will happen because we need to go into material preview. So I'm just going to left click that. And you'll see right away that our material isn't displaying properly, and that's because in Blender 4.2 everything gets turned kind of black by default, and we need to enable a setting. If you're in Blender 4.1, the colors should be showing fine, and we'll only have a couple of other things to fix. Also, we can't see our nodes in here, so I'm just going to left click the view again and then choose frame all. And now we can see our nodes again. So I'll come to my render properties menu here, and I'm going to change my render engine to Eevee, since this material preview mode uses the Eevee render engine. So even if we're not rendering in Eevee, we do need to fix this issue by going into the Eevee settings. Then I'm going to scroll down to ray tracing, and I'm going to check this box to enable it. Then I can change my max roughness to 1. And now you can see it's working properly again. If you're having any issues with this, I recommend just using an earlier Blender version, such as Blender 4.1. I'm going to change my render engine from Eevee back to cycles, since our texture baking process happens in cycles, and that will keep us ready for later. The first thing you'll notice is our bricks looks very distorted, and the first reason for that is because we edited our object in object mode and we didn't apply the scale. It's also going to be important to apply the scale before we UV unwrap as well. First of all, I'm going to show you why it's important to do before UV unwrapping. So I'm going to come to the top left hand corner, and this cross shape should appear, and I'm just going to left click and hold and then drag, and I'm just going to pull it out to around here. I'll change the editor type from the 3D viewport to the UV editor. Then we can't see our UV, which is normal. I just need to come to my 3D viewport here and press tab to go into edit mode. And if I press A to select everything, you can see our UV in here. As we discussed in the last video, the most optimal UV unwrap for texture baking and texture painting for cube based objects is just to use the Smart UV project option, because it's a little bit more optimized for texture space. So we're going to do that again by pressing A to select everything, U, and then choose Smart UV project. And I'm going to set my island margin here to 0.01. and press unwrap. And you'll notice that we have only squares here, even though we have some rectangle shapes here. You'll also notice how the brick is still looking pretty distorted. There's two things we need to think about here. First of all, our brick shader here is actually using a UV in order to place our material onto the object. The second thing is, because we haven't applied our scale, it's also going to be distorted in the UV editor here too. So let's start off by applying the scale. So I'm going to press tab to come back into object mode. I'm going to press Ctrl A, then I'm going to choose apply scale. Now when I press tab to go back into edit mode, press A to select everything, and then I'll choose U and then Smart UV project. All our settings are the same, so I can just press unwrap. You can see that everything has been unwrapped proportionally, and now everything is at the right scale. But something you'll notice is that we have a lot of visible seams here which we might not want. This is because our UV here is great for texture baking, but not for putting our procedural material onto. As you can see, there's all these gaps, and things aren't going to be lined up properly. So rather than tweaking it manually, we can do a couple of unwraps instead. The first option that might come to mind is to use a cube projection. So I'm going to press A, and then I'm going to choose U, and then I'm going to choose cube projection. And you'll notice that straight away that's looking a lot better, but this is a great quick option. The second option would be to do a seam-based UV unwrap, in which case we can just use the free U method. So I'm going to press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select mode, and I'm going to left click this edge here, and I'm going to press Ctrl left click to select these seams, or you can just press Shift left click. And what you'll notice is I'm actually selecting 3 kind of U shapes or C shapes in a row like this, and that is pretty much the basics of how you unwrap any kind of cube. I cover this more in depth in my UV unwrapping for beginners course, so if you haven't checked that out and you're confused by this, I recommend checking that out. Then we can right click and choose Mark Seam, and then we can press A, U, and then unwrap. And you can see here, it's created a shape here, which if we look at it from the front where our seams aren't there, you can see everything is connected perfectly. But of course, the only problem with seam-based unwraps is you have unavoidable seams here. So in my opinion, I think we should go for the cube projection, but this is totally up to you. If you do want to go for this option, you might want to change the scale by maybe setting this to something like 2 to double the size. So I'm going to press A, and then I'm going to right click and then choose clear seam. And then I'm just going to choose U and then choose cube projection. And I'm also going to left click my scale here and set it back to 1. Awesome, so that has actually got our brick placed on our material. Let's now talk about the baking. So first of all, the UV we have already is going to work just fine for a texture bake, so we can just leave that as it is, and we don't need to worry about baking onto a second UV or anything like that. Then I'm going to come to my brick wall shader and just show you a little bit more about what this premium shader can do. So this scale will just change the size of everything here. Brick scale will scale just the bricks. Offset, as you can see, changes the alignment of the bricks. I'll change that back to 0.5. Offset frequency controls how often that offset happens. You can see we've got a bunch of settings here which I've added, which you can alter. Even got some details like altering the color noise scale, so I really went to the next level to give you as much control as possible with this shader. Roughness strength here will just control the strength of your reflections. If I press tab to come into object mode, you can see that this brick is quite rough, as it should be. But if you wanted to make it really reflective for some reason, you could turn this down to something like -1. And you can see we've now got a really reflective brick. Maybe this would be good if you're wanting to make your bricks wet or something like that. I'm going to set my roughness strength back to 1. Then we've got our bump strength and brick bump strength. And this just controls the bump effect, which if you don't know, bump is just simulating depth by editing the normals, just like a normal map. We also have scale for XYZ. So I could change the Y scale, for example, to scale the entire brick on the Y axis of this material. I'm going to set that back to 1. UV or object will just choose what type of coordinates work best. As I was talking about, this brick material uses the UV coordinates by default, which is why we went through all that stuff with using the cube projection UV unwrap. I always like to use the UV coordinates for bricks, as object doesn't tend to work too well for the brick texture. As compared to the other procedural built-in textures you get in Blender, the brick texture is only 2D instead of 3D, meaning it doesn't have an extra axis to be mapped across while using the object coordinates, which means it doesn't quite work as well. You can see if I change this to 0 to use the object coordinates, it's only working on the top and the bottom since it's only a 2D procedural texture. I'll change it back to 1 to use the UV again, which we set up. And yeah, that's the basics of how this brick shader works. If you left click this node tree here and I zoom out, you can see we have quite a lot of nodes here which go into making this setup. But again, as I explained in the last texture baking tutorial, this shader here is really all you need to be thinking about, because all of these are pretty much just inputs that are coming into this shader, and this shader is what determines what's going to be baked. So think of it as when we're baking the diffuse or the base color, we're just baking all the information going into this base color slot here. When we're baking the roughness channel, we're just baking everything going into this channel here. And when we're baking a normal map, we just bake everything that goes into there. The only thing that's going to cause us a little bit of trouble is when we are baking the bump map or the height map, in which case we're going to need to combine these two here and plug that into the emission in order to bake it. But we're going to cover that last. So let's go ahead and get started with the base color map or diffuse map. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture. Then I'll go ahead and press plus new, and I'm just going to call this diffuse brick, and we're going to make it 2K again. Width and height, I'm just going to left click and then quickly drag down. And that's going to allow us to edit both these at the same time. I can left click at the end here, press shift and then hold down the 8 key. That's going to add this time symbol, and then we can type in the number 2 and press enter. And now let's change both of those to 2K at the same time. Then I'll just press new image, and I'm going to make sure my color space is set to sRGB. Then all we need to do is come to our render properties up here, and the render engine we're going to make sure is set to cycles, since texture baking always happens in cycles. Then under render, I'm going to change my max samples to 10, since we're only baking the diffuse channel and we're not baking any lighting information. The viewport samples doesn't really matter, since baking will just use the render samples. Then I'll come down to my bake settings here. If you can't see it, you can just left click it to open it. And I'm going to change my bake type from combined, which should be the default, just down to diffuse, which is for the color. Contributions here, you can see that I've got direct and indirect off. So if you have direct and indirect on, make sure to turn those off. What direct and indirect do is they will add the lighting information from the scene to our texture bake. We only want to bake the color information on the shader and keep things independent from the lighting around it. So I'm going to turn off the direct and indirect for this, and we can keep the color on. Then make sure you have a nice margin, maybe around 16 pixels or so, and then make sure you have your diffuse brick texture node selected here by just left clicking it. Also make sure you have your object selected, and then we can just go ahead and press bake. Now you can see that our texture bake has been generated here on the left. You might need to zoom out if you're quite zoomed in by using the scroll wheel. And now I'm just going to plug it into a second brick wall here just to show you our progress as we go. But before I do that, we're going to need to save our texture just in case Blender crashes, as these image textures won't be saved inside of the Blender file, and rather they need to be saved as their own PNG or JPEG or other image format in your files somewhere. So what I can do is left click this image with a star beside it, and that star just indicates it needs to be saved, and I'll just left click this save button. Then I'm just going to find a suitable location on my computer where I want to store my texture bakes, and I'm just going to left click this plus new folder button, and I'm just going to call this brick 2K textures. and just press enter. Then I'll double click it to open it, and here you can also choose your file format at the top. So I'm going to keep it at PNG, and I'm just going to press save as image to save. Awesome. One thing to keep in mind, if you ever want to rebake your texture, so if you want to rebake on top of this diffuse brick texture by left clicking it and then pressing bake again, maybe if you'd change the color for example, what you would need to do is once that's finished, you just left click image and then just choose save. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to left click my brick wall here, and then I'm just going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and then I'm going to press G and then X to move it along the X axis. And I'll just left click to save its position. Then for this one, I'm just going to press the X beside the brick material just to remove it. And then I'm just going to press this plus new to add a new material. It looks like we've lost our nodes again, so I can just left click view and then choose frame all. Also, if you have a bigger keyboard, there is a home key which you can press, which will take you straight to it. But if not, you can just use the view and then choose frame all. Now let's go ahead and set up these textures. So I'm going to press Shift A and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture, and I'm just going to left click that there. I can then left click this drop down here, and I can choose my diffuse brick 2K from here. Alternatively, you can also press the open button and find it from your file browser. You can also do that by pressing the folder button when you've already added an image, which just does the same thing. I'll press Shift A, and we're going to want to make sure we're using the right coordinates. So under input, I'm going to choose texture coordinate. And since we're using the UV map here to bake, it makes sense that we use the UV coordinates when using this texture map on an object with that UV map. So I'll plug my UV into the vector here, and I'm going to plug my color into the base color. Another thing to make sure is that you've got the right color space, so we need the sRGB color space for this texture. And yeah, you can see that our texture bake has worked nice, and now all we need to do is bake the roughness and then the normal or bump. So I'm going to left click my brick again, and I'm going to press the home key just to return to my nodes, or you can go to view and then frame all. And if you like, you can just go ahead and duplicate this, so I can just press Shift D with my texture selected, and I can then go ahead and press the X to remove that. Then I'm going to press plus new, and this time I'm going to call it roughness brick 2K. And since we changed our resolution last time, it's been saved, so it's already set to 2K for us, which is nice. And then I can just go ahead and press new image. Since this is a grayscale image, we're going to change our color space to non-color. And then I'm going to come up to my bake type. All the other settings can be kept the same, as we're not baking any lighting information, so we can still keep our sample count at 10. And I'm going to change my bake type here to roughness, and all this should be fine at the default, making sure I've got a margin here as well as always. And what's going to happen when I press bake is if I left click this node tree button here to go inside, is it's just going to bake everything going into this roughness channel here. And as we know, roughness just controls the clarity of reflections. So I'll left click my roughness brick 2K, and then I'm just going to make sure I've still got my object selected, and then choose bake. Alright, awesome. So our roughness texture bake is done, but something you might notice is this thing is pure white. That means it's just going to be completely rough all over, which isn't what I've actually done in the node setup. So this is actually a mistake on my part. You can see there is a roughness strength parameter here, and earlier I said I'm going to set it back to 1, but the default I set for this is actually 0. So that is something you want to be careful when you're making your own custom nodes. Make sure you know what your default values for these things are if you're changing them to avoid making mistakes like this. But thankfully it's very easy to fix. All we need to do is just set this back down to 0, which is the default. Of course, if you do want it to be a bit rougher, you can still set a bit higher, but 1 was a little bit overkill, I think. So I'm just going to set to 0, and then we can left click our roughness brick 2K texture again, and then just choose bake again. Awesome, so now it's finished baking. You can see we've got a much better looking result here, and this actually looks like it has some variation in the roughness between the bricks here and the mortar, which is just the name for the cracks. So if yours looks like a slightly different shade of grey from mine, don't worry, because I think I might have accidentally tweaked the colours while trying to figure out what was wrong with it. So if yours looks slightly different, don't worry, that's fine. As long as you've got a contrast between the brick and the mortar, then you should be all good to go. So let's go ahead and save this image. So I'm just going to left click the image and then choose save. And then I'm going to come to my brick textures folder, and I'm just going to press save as image here. Perfect. Let's go ahead and plug this into our object here. So I'll left click my second one here, and I'm going to press the home key. I'm just going to give this a name. So where it says material.001, I'll left click it and then just type in brick baked. And I'll left click my image texture here and press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll press the drop down here, and I'm going to choose my roughness brick 2K, and I'm going to plug my UV into the vector and color into the roughness. Perfect, now it's all hooked up. Then I'm going to left click my brick again and press the home key to return to my nodes. Or again, you can press view and then choose frame all. And again, if you want to take this into another software which uses gloss instead of roughness, we can bake it with an inverted roughness channel. So all we need to do that is first left click the node tree to go inside, and all we need to worry about is the roughness to the last node that was connected, and this noodle here is the only one we need to edit. So I'll press Shift A, then under color, I'm going to choose invert color, and I'll just plug that in between there. And right now our reflections are going to be incorrect because of course we're inverting this, and so we're actually turning it into a gloss map, which is not really what Blender works with. It works with roughness instead. Usually if you brung a gloss map into Blender you would have to invert it to turn to roughness, but since we're inverting something which is roughness, it's now turned into a gloss map. And that means when we bake it, we will now have a gloss map which we can use for 3D softwares which don't use roughness. So let's go up by left clicking this arrow button here, and we're going to create another texture. So I'll left click this one here, press Shift D, and I'll press the X button to delete that, and I'll press plus new. Our width and height should still be the same, and then we can just type in gloss brick 2K, and then I can just press new image. And since it's still a grayscale image, so we need to change our color space to non-color, and then everything should be good to go, so we can just go ahead and press bake. Awesome, and now we can see our gloss here. You can see how it's pretty much just the opposite way around from the roughness. If I left click this drop down and choose roughness, you can see it is literally just the opposite. So I'll change it back to the gloss here, and we can go ahead and show you how to plug this in if you did need to use a gloss map in Blender. So I'll press the home key, and I'll just left click this roughness texture here and press Shift D to duplicate it. I'll zoom in, and in this drop down here I'll choose my gloss. I'll plug my vector into this UV of the texture coordinate, so it's using the UV map, and then I'll plug my color into roughness. Right now this will be using incorrect reflections because it's gloss into roughness, and so we need to invert it first to make it compatible with Blender. So I'll come to the color tab, and then I'm going to choose invert color and just plug that in between here. And now our gloss has been turned back into roughness. So to simplify what I've just done here, these two nodes here are the same as this texture here, more or less. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to plug my roughness back into the roughness, as technically it's a little bit better since it has one less node, meaning one less calculation. I'll box select these nodes and just drag them over here, since we're probably not going to use them. I'll left click my brick texture again, and now let's go ahead and bake some normal maps. So first of all, let's create a texture to bake onto. So I can just press Shift A, then under texture, I'll just choose image texture. Then I'll press plus new, and I'll call this OpenGL normal brick 2K. The reason why I've said OpenGL is because the two main types of normal maps, which are OpenGL and DirectX, tend to work with different softwares. So Blender uses OpenGL, so when we bake our normal information, it's going to be OpenGL by default. So that's why I've named it that way. I'll show you how to bake the DirectX as well, just in case you need to use this normal map in a software which uses DirectX by default. So I'll just go ahead and press new image, and color space, even though it's going to create this kind of purpley image, it's still non-color, so I'm going to change it to non-color. And now we should be ready to go for that. I'll then come to my bake settings here. We can still keep our render settings the same at a low sample count like that. And I'm going to change my bake type from roughness to normal. And all these settings we can keep at the default. And just to explain what's going to happen here when I press bake is if I go into my node tree by clicking this, you can see that this purple socket here called normal, that is what is going to be baked when we press bake. So all of these nodes that are going into that purple socket are what's going to be turned into our image texture. So I'll press this arrow to go back up. Just before we bake, I just remembered we need to actually save our gloss texture. So you can see how easily it is that even though I've been doing this for years, even I forget to do this sometimes. So don't beat yourself up if you forget to save your texture. So I'm just going to come up to this image with a star beside it, and then I'm going to choose save. I'll come to the location where I want to save it, so just with my other textures here, and I'll just save it as gloss brick 2K. Again, you can choose your file format here if you want to save it as a JPEG or something, but I'm just going to keep it as PNG and then choose save as image. And there we go. Now we should be safe if Blender crashes or if we want to close out of our Blender file. But for our normal, all I'm going to do is left click my OpenGL normal brick 2K texture, make sure I've got my object selected, and then I can just go ahead and press bake. Awesome. And when it's finished, it should look something like this. And as I mentioned, this is the default normal map that Blender works with since it's OpenGL. So if I left click my baked brick object here, I'll just press the home key to return to my nodes, or you can come to view and then choose frame all. I'll left click one of my textures here and press Shift D to duplicate it. And in my drop down here, which is just this little image button, I can choose my OpenGL brick texture. It'll have the correct color space of non-color set up already. And I can left click my vector and plug it into the UV. And also before I plug this in, we'll need to save our image. So I'll come to the top left hand corner, and where it says image with a star, I'll press save. Come to my location where I've saved my other textures, and I'll just press save as image since we have the correct name already. And there you can see the star has disappeared, indicating that it's been saved correctly. Then unfortunately I can't just plug this color into the normal, as that's not going to work properly. We need to give it something to work with first. So I'll press Shift A, and then under vector I'm going to choose normal map, and this is going to allow us to use this texture with our shader. So I'll plug the color into the color, leave the strength at 1, which is just going to use it totally, and then I'll put the normal into the normal, and you can see now we now have the depth detail too, and it's pretty much starting to look like the same material. But as I mentioned, there's another type of normal map called a DirectX normal map, and this might be needed if you're using these textures in another 3D software which doesn't use OpenGL normal maps but uses DirectX normal maps instead. So to do this, I'll just left click my other brick, and I'll press View and then Frame All to come back to all my nodes, and I'll just left click one of my textures and press Shift D to duplicate the image texture, left click the X to remove the texture, and we'll create a new one. So I'll press plus new, and I'll call this DirectX normal brick 2K. I'll keep the width and height at 2048, and I'll just choose new image. Then we want to make sure our color space is set to non-color, and now this is all good to go. So how are we going to make it a DirectX normal map? Well, a DirectX normal map compared to an OpenGL map has only one difference. The green channel, or the Y channel, is flipped. So thankfully, Blender makes this really easy for us. If I want to bake this as a DirectX, I can come to my bake settings, and under influence, you can see that we can change the XYZ here. So I can just change the green or Y channel to -Y, and that's just going to invert the green channel when it's baked, turning it into a DirectX normal map. So now I've done that, I'll just make sure I have my DirectX normal brick selected, make sure our object is selected, and then I can go ahead and press bake. Awesome, and now that's been baked successfully. If you look closely, you can see that it kind of looks a little bit different from the normal map. I'll just choose the drop down here to show you the difference. You can see how they look inverted here. So I'll choose my DirectX normal map again, and we're going to want to make sure we save it. So I'll left click the image and then choose save or save as, and I'll come to my folder where we now have quite a nice collection of brick textures here, and I'll just keep the name the same and just choose save as image. Now if Blender crashes or we quit, our textures will be safe. I'll left click my baked brick model here, and I'll press view and then choose frame all to see all my nodes again. And I'm now going to show you how we can set up the DirectX normal map if you ever do get a DirectX normal map which you need to use inside of Blender. The reason we need to do extra steps is because, like I mentioned, DirectX is not the default which Blender works with. Rather, Blender works with OpenGL normal maps by default, which means when we use a DirectX normal map in Blender, we need to invert the green channel in order to turn it into pretty much an OpenGL normal map. So I'm just going to left click and then shift left click these two nodes and press Shift D to duplicate them. I'll then left click and drag this vector and plug it into the UV, so we're using the right coordinates. And I'll zoom in here and I'm going to change it from the OpenGL normal map to the DirectX normal map. If I plug this in just now without changing anything, you can see it's going to look like the bricks are being pushed inwards and the mortar is being pushed out. So you can see why it's important that we do need to fix this. So as I mentioned, we need to invert the green channel. And when we were baking, that was really easy. We just needed to switch a quick setting to get our DirectX normal map. But to convert a DirectX normal map back into an OpenGL normal map while using it in our shader, we do need to use a couple of nodes. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under Converter, I'm going to choose Combine XYZ, and I'm going to press Shift A again, and then under Converter, I'm going to choose Separate XYZ. Now, as I mentioned, it's the green channel that's flipped, but green and Y are pretty much the same thing. So you can use either XYZ or the RGB, whatever you prefer. For this example, I'm going to use this. So I'm going to plug my color into the vector, and the X will plug into the X, the Y will plug into the Y, and the Z will plug into the Z. Then I'll plug my vector into the color. And after doing that, absolutely nothing will change. And that's because we're essentially saying, take this, separate it out into its three components, take it back into its three components, and then put it back into it. So pretty much this node setup is the same as just plugging the color into the color. But the reason we've done this is because we need to invert the Y channel or the green channel. And so since we've now got a noodle here, we can add an invert node in between these. So I'll press Shift A, and then under color, I'm going to choose invert color and plug it in between the Y. And there we are. Now you can see it's been fixed. So if you need to use a DirectX normal map inside of Blender, that is how we can do it. I'm going to start making things a little bit more organized here. So I'm just going to left click and drag these nodes. And if you remember, we can press Ctrl and then J to put a panel around it. And here in the node options here, we can give it a label as well. So I'm just going to call it DirectX Setup. And I can just drag that over here. But we're going to want to use our OpenGL setup. So just left click and box like these, press Ctrl J, and I'll give this the label of OpenGL Setup. And I'm going to plug that into the normal like that. And I'm going to move my DirectX setup over with the gloss setup we made earlier. You can go ahead and organize all these other setups as well if you would like to. It does help keep things more organized and clearer to understand. Finally, let's go over how we can bake the bump. So I'm going to left click my brick texture here. Then we can't see our nodes, so I'll just press view and then choose frame all. And I'm going to zoom in to my nodes here, and I'll just left click one of them, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it. I'll press the X to get rid of this texture that's in it just now, and I'll press plus new, and I'm just going to call this height brick 2K. I'll keep my dimensions at 2048 by 2048 to make it 2K, and then I'm just going to choose new image. This is also a grayscale image, so I'm going to choose non-color for my color space. And now we just need to go into our node tree here and set some things up. The reason why is because if I come over to my bake settings here, you can see I don't have any height options here, which means we need to bake it using another parameter. Usually the best one to go for is emit, and I'll show you why. So you can see that my normal setup here is made up of 2 bump nodes. Thankfully, it's nothing more complex than that, as sometimes you will be dealing with a lot more bump nodes, in which case I would be much more willing to throw in the towel and just probably bake the normal map. But if you really need the height map, you could still do it technically. So I need to put these 2 inputs in the height of these bump nodes, and then I need to plug them into something called the emission. I could just plug it into the emission color here, and then when I set my bake type to emit here, it will allow us to just bake that emission, which is going to bake us a height map. So first things first, let's press Shift A, and then under color, I'm going to choose mix color. And we're going to need to find our height inputs. So here's one here, this noise texture. I'll just plug that into socket A, and then we can follow the other one here, and you can see that's this brick texture here. So I'll plug that into there. And right now, to show you what this is looking like, temporarily, I'm going to plug in my result into this brick wall shader, which is just going to take it to the output. If I zoom in, right now, you can see it's kind of mixing between the two, but it's kind of just taking an average of the two. And you can see as I change the slider, it's going to use one or the other. So 0 for the first input and 1 for the other input. And 0.5 will take it so it's in between. So what I'm going to want to go for here is a perfect blend between the two, so I'll keep it at 0.5. But we still have one problem, and that's that if you look at my bump node here, this channel here was inverted, meaning the height has been flipped. So this node here is the same as this B socket input here. So all I need to do is add an invert node between this B socket and the input for the height. So I'll press Shift A, and then under color, I'll choose invert color and just plug it in here. And now you can see, if you understand how the colors represent what's going to be protruding and what's not, you'll see this makes a lot more sense. This is because the areas that are whiter or closer to 1 are going to be the areas sticking out, and the areas that are darker or closer to 0 are going to be the parts which are more inward. And that makes sense since the mortar or the cracks are going to be deeper in, whereas the bricks themselves are going to be pushed out. Then next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to left click this clamp result checkbox. This is a bit of a technicality, but pretty much it's going to make sure that the output is between 0 and 1, meaning we won't have any issues. Although there is a chance that maybe baking automatically clamps anyway, but I'm not too sure on that. So I'll clamp it just to be safe. Then I'm going to plug my mix result into my emission color, since this is what we're going to be baking, and we'll keep our strength on 1. If you want to get a slightly more accurate result, you could actually bake these as 2 separate height maps and then combine them with bump nodes like we've done here. Then I'm going to plug my BSDF into the brick wall shader, and right now you're going to see it's going to kind of glow, and that's because we plugged it into emission temporarily in order to do this height bake. So I'll then left click this arrow to go up, and since we've already created our height brick texture, I'll just left click it, and then I can go ahead, make sure my bake type is set to emit. All these settings should be fine, so I can go ahead and just press bake. Awesome, and now you can see on the left here, we've got a nice height map ready to use. And so the reason why you might want to make this rather than a normal map is, one, you can use it for other things such as a displacement, for example, and of course you can use it with your bump node, which will have a slightly more detail than your normal map. The only caveat with that though is that normal maps tend to be a little bit faster, but it's great to have the option. So I'm going to then come to this image button and then choose save. I'll come to the location in my computer where I've saved my other textures, and I'm happy with the name, so I'll just choose save as image. And now we need to fix our shader here. So what I can do is I can go into my node tree by left clicking this, and I'm just going to go ahead and unplug this from the emission socket, and now everything is back to normal. I'll press this arrow to come up, and now let's go ahead and try and set up this bump on the other object. So I'll left click this baked brick, I'll left click the view, and then choose frame all to see all of our nodes. This time I'll just left click one of my textures and press Shift D to duplicate, and I'll plug my UV coordinates, my texture coordinate, into the vector, and I'm just going to drag it down here. and zoom in, and I'll press this drop down here, and I'm going to switch it to the height brick. Again, if you don't have it in your blend file, you can just press this folder button to open and find the height. Then I'll press Shift A, and then under vector, I'm going to choose bump, and I'm just going to plug my height into here, and then I can plug my normal all the way up into here. Use this to replace the normal map. You can see straight away we have a lot more detail. So with this one, we might want to turn down the strength a little bit. So maybe I'll change it to something like 0.2, or maybe something like 0.35. And there, that looks quite good. So you can see how I'm getting quite a lot more detail around here. So if that's kind of what you're going for, then this can be a good option. Again though, to get the most accurate result with a bump, I recommend baking 2 height maps and then combining them with 2 bump nodes. However, I'm not going to do that in this tutorial, but in the next tutorial, just in case you want to learn how to do that. But yeah, for now, that just about covers it. Well done in completing this baking lesson. It was quite a long one, but I hope you got some value out of it and some good practice. Feel free to share your results in the community, as I would love to see how you're getting on with this course. But apart from that, I'd like to thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next installment of this course. Take care. Today, let's learn how to bake 2 individual height maps from a single shader node setup. Hey, so this one is going to be a quick carry on from the last installment of this course, where I'm going to show you how to bake 2 individual height maps to get a slightly more accurate bump result. So I'll left click my first brick one, which we made last time, and then I'll press view and then choose frame all, and this creates some new textures. It's getting a bit messy here, so I might actually just left click and drag and just delete all of these by pressing X, because we have them all saved anyway on our computer. And I'll press Shift A, and then under texture I'm going to choose image texture, then I'm going to press plus new, and this one I'm going to call height brick only brick 2K. It's a bit of a complex name, but that's just to help me understand what this does. So by brick only, what I mean is that it's going to be just the brick and mortar bump, whereas the other one is going to be more like the extra details. So now I've done that, I'm going to press new image. We're going to keep our bake settings here on emit, and we also have our render max sample set to 10 since we don't need many samples. Then I'll go into my node tree here, and now what we're going to do is, you can see I've got my A and B socket. So if you remember last time, A is just the input from this one here, so you can see I can just plug this noise texture straight into my color emission like that. And this one is going to be for our extra details. But if you remember, we created a texture for the brick only first, so we're actually going to need to use the other one. So we're going to get the B socket. So the B socket is this brick texture here. So I can plug that into my color instead. Awesome, but there's one small problem. If you look here, you can see that I've got this invert box checked, which means we're going to need to use an invert node. I'm just going to left click and drag these 2 nodes and delete them since we used them last time and we don't need them now. And then I'm going to press Shift A, and then under color, I'm going to choose invert color, and I'll just plug it in between here, and that's going to invert that input. One thing you will want to make sure as well is that your strength is set to 1. It's always important to double check that if your bake isn't working. So I'll press this arrow again to come back, left click my height only brick 2K texture, make sure I have my object selected in here, and then I can just go ahead and press bake. Awesome, and now it's finished. You can see we have our brick only here, and you can see there's none of the other imperfections. It's just this brick bump on its own, which is just what we're wanting. So let's go ahead and now create the second bump, which will be the imperfections one. So I'll just press Shift D with this texture selected to duplicate it, and I'll then press this X to remove it, and then I'll press plus new, and this time I'm going to call it height brick imperfection brick 2K. So a nice descriptive name. If you want to keep your name shorter, you certainly can. It's totally up to you. And I'm just going to go ahead and press new image, and I'll change my color space to non-color, as I accidentally forgot to do that on the last one. But don't worry, I'll put a reminder in the video to let you know to do that. And also we need to save our other texture. So this height brick only brick 2K, I'm just going to left click image and then choose save. I'll come to my file browser here, and I'm just going to press save as image in here. And then I'm going to come back to my height brick imperfection, and I'll open up my node tree here. And now we're going to want to plug in our noise texture bump here. So this one doesn't need inverted because you can see the invert box isn't checked. So I can just simply drag that factor into the color, and then I can press this up button here. Make sure I have my height brick imperfection selected, make sure it's the right one, make sure I've got my object selected, and then I can just go ahead and press bake again. and you can see we now have just our imperfection baked here. Then I'll press image and then save, and in my texture locations I can just press save as image, and now we have all of our brick height textures saved. Then we need to fix our shader here, so I can come back into my node tree and I'm just going to unplug everything from the emission socket, and you can see that's turned everything back to normal. I'll press the up arrow and I'm going to left click my texture baked object, and I'll press view and then frame all to come back to my nodes, and you can see last time we just used one height texture for this, but this time we're going to be using two. So first of all, I'll add a new texture. So I'll press Shift A, and then under texture, I'll choose image texture, and I'm going to choose my imperfection first. So I'll choose the imperfection, and I'll plug my vector into the UV of our texture coordinate. So it's using our UV maps texture coordinates. Then I'll press Shift A, and then under vector, I'll choose bump, and I'll plug our color into the height, and we'll make sure our color space is on non-color, and then I'm going to plug my normal into the normal. You can see right now all that's going to do is just use the imperfection on its own at max strength, so we need to combine it with the other one. Thankfully, to do that it's very simple. I'm just going to left click and drag some of these nodes just to kind of move them out of the way. So I'll left click to select them, and I'll maybe shift select some of the stragglers here, and I'll press G just to move them along, and I'm going to move these nodes along here. I'll just left click this image texture here, this height brick imperfection, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to choose my other height texture. So I'll click the drop down, or you can click the open button and choose it from the file browser, and I'll choose my only brick height, plug this vector into my UV texture coordinates, and now to combine it we're going to need another bump node. So I'll left click this bump node and press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll plug my color into the height, and now to combine them it's really simple. You just plug this normal into the normal of the other one, and that's just going to allow you to easily add them on top of each other. You can see how that's added them on top of each other nicely like that, and right now it's looking really detailed, and that's because I've actually used a different strength for each of these in the original shader. So I'll left click this original shader so we can use it as a reference. I'll press view and then frame all. If I zoom into this parameter called extra bump strength and brick bump strength, so as you might imagine, brick bump strength is the brick only texture we made. So I'm just going to set that one to 0.5. So I'll left click my baked brick, come to view and then frame all, and we're looking for the only brick, and that one's going to be 0.5. Then for the other one I think I used something much lower, so I'll left click this one here, view and then frame all, zoom in, and the extra bump strength I used for this one was 0.07, so quite small. So I'll left click this baked brick again, come to view, frame all, and then in my bump strength for the imperfection I'll choose 0.07. And now it's using the exact same settings using textures. And you will notice that even though these two are combined, the strength of this one will not affect the strength of this bump here, which is quite a nice feature that Blender has. Think of it as more this normal is being stored in here and then outputted here, so it won't be affected by any of these bump settings, which allows us to add bump nodes really easily. And yeah, that just about covers it. I thought I would cover how to do that if you're wanting a little bit more control over your height maps, so you can get a little bit more detail than your normal or your combined bump map. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to share your thoughts in the community. Apart from that, I'd like to thank you so much for watching this installment in the course, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Texture baking with spheres. Hey everyone, welcome back to Texture Baking Mastery. Today I'm going to be talking about baking with spheres and the different methods you can use. So as a general rule of thumb, I found that UV spheres work better than quad spheres. So to get started, if you go down into the description, there's a usually paid material, but I'm giving it to you guys for free. It's a Square Tiles procedural material, which you can download, and once you've done that, we'll just come to our file browser here, and you should be able to just find it in your downloads here. And so all you can do here is you just left click it, then you can right click and choose extract all, and you can choose a location where you want to save it. I'm just going to extract it into the downloads folder for simplicity's sake, and I'll just press extract. Then when it's done, you'll get a folder called Square Tiles, and I can just double click it to open it, and in here you'll be able to find the blend file with the Square Tiles. So back in Blender, what I'm going to do is, first of all, we're going to add some spheres. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under mesh I'm going to choose UV sphere, and here in the bottom left hand corner a little menu will appear. This allows you to increase the resolution of your UV sphere if you like. So maybe you could change it to something like 64 by 32, and I'll just double it. Yeah, there we go, a little bit more smoother. Then of course we need to make it shade smooth, so we'll just right click it and then choose shade smooth. Then I'm going to change from the timeline here to the shader editor, and I'm just going to pull this up, and I'm going to change it from line style here to object. And now if I left click this drop down here to choose my material, you'll see we won't be able to find it, and that's because we need to import it into Blender. To do that, we can just press file, and then we can just left click append, which is like importing for Blender related files. And then if you come to your downloads, we can just go into our square tiles and we just open up these folders, and I'm just going to import the basic tiles here, and then I can just choose material, and then I can just choose basic tiles and then choose append. Then I can left click this drop down here, and now I can choose my basic tiles. Now right now we can't actually see our material because we need to go into material preview. So I'm going to come to the top here and change to material preview. And right now you can see our material has gone completely black, and that's because we're in Blender 4.2. And as you know, there's a few settings we need to set up in Blender 4.2 to get things working properly in the material preview. So if you're in Blender 4.1 or earlier, you won't need to worry about this. So I'll come up to my render properties, and then I'm going to change render engine to Eevee. And if you remember, we can come down to ray tracing, and I can check this box here and change my max roughness to 1. And there we go. Now you can see our material is working properly. You can see right now our material is being projected from the top down. That's because this is using a brick procedural texture, which if you remember is one of the 2D procedural built-in textures. So in order to understand what's going on here, I'm going to come to the top left hand corner where the cross will appear, and I can just left click and drag to pull out another menu. Then I'm going to change from this 3D viewport here to the UV editor, and in order to see our UV I can just press tab to go into edit mode and press A to select everything. And you can see it's created a UV here automatically, and this is the UV that I like to use for spheres. Because of the way I've designed these node groups here, I can just use the UV or object switch to switch, and now it's going to use the UV instead of object, and you can see it's going to start projecting it a little bit better, but it's a little bit small, so I'll just change the scale to maybe something like 3 or maybe 4. And then you can see that we don't have squares anymore, so I'll press tab to come back into object mode. And to fix that, it's very simple. All I need to do is scroll down, and I can change my coordinate scale here to 0.5 on the Y. And now they're back to being square again. So you might be wondering if Smart UV Project is a better option for this, but actually the answer would be no here. I would say that I tested both of them, and I found that the default UV sphere, UV, works great and seems to be a lot less pixelated. However, I will show you how to UV unwrap other types of spheres as well. So what we can do is I'll press Shift A, and then this time I'm going to choose cube, then I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode, A to select everything, then I'll right click and then subdivide it, and in this subdivide menu I'm just going to increase the number of cuts to maybe something like 16, and then I'm going to come up to mesh, and then there should be an option here called transform, and then under here you can just choose to sphere, and if you type in the number 1, that's going to turn this cube into a sphere. Press tab to come back into object mode, and I'll press G and X to move this along, and then I'm going to right click and shade smooth. So now we've got two types of spheres. I just press S and then scaled it down, and then I'll press Control A and then choose scale. And this sphere here doesn't have a default UV, it's still using the cube UV. If I press tab to go into edit mode, you can see it's using the default cube UV. But there is an issue with this, because if I press tab to come back to object mode here and I choose my basic tiles material, you can see since it's using this cube UV, it looks very different here, and we're going to have to come up with a different strategy to get it to map out like it is on this UV sphere here. But I'll cover that a little bit later. For now, let's cover how we can bake these tiles here. So I'll left click this one here and just press H to hide it, and I'll left click my sphere here. And today we're not going to be baking any height or anything like that, since I went quite in depth on that in the last episode. Today we're just going to be doing the color, roughness, and normal. So let's get started. As always, if I left click this node tree button here, just to keep your understanding strong, when we're baking the diffuse or base color, it's just going to be looking at this base color input from the principal BSDF, and that's what's going to become our texture output. The same will apply for roughness and of course normal as well. To get started, let's add a texture. So I'll press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture, and then I'm going to press plus new, and I'm going to make this 2K, so I can just left click, quickly drag down, and then I can left click the end, and then press Shift and then 8 to add a star sign, and then 2. And what it's going to do when I press enter is times both of them by 2 to make it a 2K texture. I'm just going to call this diffuse tiles, and then UV sphere, just to keep it nice and descriptive. Then I'm just going to choose new image. I'll keep my color space at sRGB since this is going to be a base color or diffuse texture, and then I'm going to come up to my render properties and change my render engine from Eevee back to cycles. Then for our render, I'm going to change my max samples to 10 since we don't need a lot of samples, since we're not baking any lighting information, we're only baking basic channels. Then I'm going to scroll down to the bottom to our bake settings. If you can't see it, you just left click it to open it, and I'm going to change my bake type from combined to diffuse. I'll turn off direct and indirect, as those will take in the lighting into consideration of our scene, and we only want to bake the color on its own. Then we'll also have a margin as well. I usually just go for 16 pixels, which is the default. And once all that's done, we should be good to go. So I'll just left click my texture here to make sure it's selected, make sure your object's selected, and then you can go ahead and left click bake. Awesome, and when it's done, it should appear here, and you can see we have our texture ready to go. And it's just been baked on top of that default UV. Of course, we'll need to make sure we save our texture. Since it won't be built into Blender, we'll need to save it as its own separate file. So if Blender crashes or we close Blender, we don't lose this texture bake. So I'll left click image, and then I'm going to choose save. Then in my file browser, I'm just going to choose a location, and then I'm going to create a new folder and just call it tile sphere textures. And I'll put 2K at the end as well, since we're making them in 2K. And I'll double click that to open it, and I might actually edit the name here and just make it tiles UV sphere 2K. And you can also choose your file format up here, but if you're happy with everything, you can just go ahead and press save as image. And now you'll notice the star has gone beside image, indicating that it's been saved. Remember, if you change any of the colors and you want to bake again and override this diffuse texture, make sure to come up to image and choose save again. If you have multiple images, there's also an option called save all images to save all of them at once. That can be handy if you've had to override a bunch of images. Then I'm going to duplicate this just to demonstrate how our texture bakes are looking. So I'm going to press Shift D with my sphere selected, and then I'm going to press G and then X just to drag it along, and I'm going to left click to save its position. Then I'm going to press the X on its material just to remove it. And I'll create a brand new material by pressing plus new. I'll press G with my selected nodes to move them along, Shift A, then under texture, I'll choose image texture, and in this drop down, I'll left click it and choose the diffuse tiles UV sphere. Keep it on sRGB, and of course we'll need to make sure it's using the correct coordinates, so I'll press Shift A, then under inputs, I'll choose texture coordinate, and I'll plug the UV into the vector, and then I can plug the color into the base color. And now you can see it's using our texture correctly. You will notice that at the top here, it struggled to get these lines here, and unfortunately that is a bit of limitation I found when baking onto spheres. But thankfully it's not the biggest issue in the world, so we can just move on for now. I'm going to left click my other UV sphere here, and in here I'm just going to left click my image texture and press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to left click this X to remove that. And then I'm going to press plus new. This time I'm going to call it roughness tiles UV sphere 2K. Then our width and height are at the right resolution, so I can just press new image, and I'll change my color space here to non-color. Then I'll come up to my bake settings here, and I'm going to change the bake type to roughness, and then we can just go ahead and make sure we have our texture selected and our right 3D model selected, and then we can just press bake. Awesome. Now you can see we've got our roughness map here. It's got some imperfections here, and of course the mortar is a really close to white color since it's pretty rough on this object I made. You can of course tweak this, because you can see in the settings here you can adjust the mortar roughness. So if you wanted to make it more reflective, you could decrease this number to something lower. Now we can go ahead and save our image. So I'll come up to the image with a star beside it and choose save. Then in my file browser, I'll just come to where I've saved my other texture and then choose save as image. And now it has been saved successfully. We're not going to do gloss today since I covered it in the past 2 tutorials, and I think you guys should be getting the idea of how baking gloss works now. But if you are struggling, feel free to let me know. Then before I plug everything into this second UV sphere here, I'm going to press Shift D with my texture selected, then I'll press X plus new, and this time I'm going to type for name open GL normal tiles UV sphere 2K. So you can see I do tend to get quite descriptive in my names, and I'm going to keep the width and height at 2048 and then choose new image, and I'll change my color space to non-color. Even though it's a purpley colored texture, we do need to use non-color here. And then I'm going to change my bake type to normal, and then I can go ahead and just left click bake. Awesome. Now you'll see we have a nice normal map for our UV sphere, and we should be ready to go ahead and plug everything in. I'm just first going to quickly save this normal map, so I'll just press the image and then choose save. Then in my file browser, I'm just going to keep everything as is, maybe double check to make sure color space is still non-color, and then choose save as image. Perfect. Now I'm going to left click my other UV sphere here, and I'm going to left click my texture here and press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll zoom in to this drop down and I'm going to choose the roughness, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate again, left click the drop down, and this time I'll choose the OpenGL normal map. For the roughness, it's really easy. All I need to do is plug the UV socket into the vector and then just plug the color into the roughness. And now you can see these are looking really similar now. Last step, I just need to do the normal map. So I'll press Shift A, and then under vector, I'll add a normal map node. This allows us to use a normal map. So I can plug this color into the color here, and also I'll hook up the UV coordinates with the vector, so it's using the UV map, and then plug the normal into the normal here. Perfect, that's that all set up. Now I want to talk about the other sphere. So if I just come up to my top right hand corner and left click this I button, you can see we have this UV sphere here, and what we want to do is we want to get this texture onto here. But as you can see right now, if I press tab to go into edit mode, our current UV layout isn't really working well with this material. So we're going to need to use this UV sphere here as a reference in order to bake onto this one. But you also might be wondering, what kind of UV unwrap do we use? Well, I like to use a Smart UV project since it's the most optimal option in our case here. So I'll press A to select everything in edit mode, and then I'm going to press U, and then I'm going to choose Smart UV project. I'm then going to set my island margin to 0.01 and then choose unwrap. If I zoom in here in my UV editor, you can see this is the unwrap we've been given, and this is a nice easy sphere unwrap which has got fairly optimized texture space here. You'll see though if I press tab to go into object mode, it will mess up our shader here, but that's fine because we're going to be baking textures onto it anyway. So how can we actually do this? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is press this X button here to remove this material, as we don't need it for now. Then I'm going to press Alt G to return it to the center, and now I'm going to press S, and you can see I can change the size. And what I want to do is I want to make it around the same size as our sphere, but we don't want it to have any of the other sphere poking through. So if you want to scale slower, you can hold down the Shift key, and that will allow you to scale a little bit slower. And I want to get it so it's kind of just getting onto the top here. About there should do. And I can just left click to save that. Now the next step is the baking itself. So if I come down to my bake settings here, I can still keep my max samples at 10. I'm going to change the bake type here to diffuse since we're going to start with color. And I'm going to left click on my original sphere, which is the sphere underneath this one. And since we've already saved these textures here, I'm just going to left click to box select and then press X to delete them for now. Then I'll press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture. And this time I'm going to press plus new, and then I'm going to type in the name, diffuse, tiles, quad, sphere. Since this is a sphere made out of quads. I'll keep it at 2K and then just press new image. Then I'm going to keep my usual diffuse settings, so indirect and direct off, and all these settings will be the same too. And all we need to do now is turn on our selected to active. So if you remember, the active object is the one with the white outline around it. And something to do actually is we've added this texture in the wrong object. So I'm just going to press X to delete this texture just now because we don't actually need it in here. And then I'm going to left click my cube here, press plus new to add a new material, and I'll press Shift A, then under texture, I'll choose image texture. Now technically we could have just made our new texture in here, but since we've already made it, we can just select it from the drop down and choose our diffuse tiles quad sphere. Then now we have that selected, I'm going to make sure I've got my cube sphere selected first, and then I'm going to select my sphere. And then what this selected to active is going to do is it's going to project the not active selected object onto our active selected object. So what that means is our not active selected one, which is the orange one here, the sphere, has our material on it. And that material is going to be projected into the texture onto our cube sphere's UV, since our cube sphere is the active selection. So that's why it's called selected to active. Then once I've done that, I can just go ahead and left click bake. Awesome. And when it's done, you can see we've got our tiles texture for our quad sphere. Now I'll just left click my texture here and press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll press the X here and I'll press plus new, and I'm going to call this roughness tiles quad sphere. And I can just press new image and change my color space to non-color. We also need to save our diffuse texture as well. So I'll come up to image and then choose save. And in the file browser, I'm just going to choose save as image. And now back to the roughness, I'll just left click this roughness texture and change the bake type from diffuse to roughness. You'll see our selected to active option is still checked, which is quite handy. And now just to demonstrate again how this works, first, we select our cube, and then we're going to shift left click our sphere in our outliner here, and that's going to make our sphere the selected but not the active selection. And then it will keep our quad sphere as the active selection. You can see it's got yellow text. So pretty much you want the cube sphere to be in yellow, and you want the normal UV sphere to be in orange, since the orange one is just a basic selected one, and the yellow one is the active, and we're projecting it from selected to active. And now we've done that, we can just go ahead and just press bake. Awesome. And now you can see we've got the roughness baked here as well. And now if we want to save it, we can just left click image and then choose save. And then in my file browser here, I'll just choose save as image. And finally, we'll left click this texture here, press Shift D to duplicate it, X to remove that texture, plus new, and we'll call this one open GL normal tiles quad sphere. Make sure it's still at 2048 by 2048, and then just press new image. And since it's a normal map, we'll need to change the color space to non-color, and I'll make sure I've got it selected. And also I'm going to deselect everything again just to demonstrate. I'm going to select the quad sphere first, which is the one with this material in it, and the UV sphere second. Then we can change it from roughness here to normal. Make sure all of these settings are the same. We've still got selected to active on, and we can just go ahead and press bake. And now we should have a normal map here, which we can use. So I'll then need to just save it. So I'll come up to this image button and then choose save. And in my file browser here, I'm just going to choose save as image. And there we go. Now what we can do is we can move our cube sphere. So I'll left click my cube sphere again, so we've only got our cube sphere selected. Then I'll press G and then X to move it along. And now to set up these nodes, it's very simple. I'll just left click and box select to drag them and just move them along. And we can plug this diffuse into our base color. And we also need to use the correct input coordinates too. So I'll press Shift A, then under input, I'll choose texture coordinate and I'll plug my UV into the vector. This makes sure it is using the UV map. And I'm going to do the same for the roughness and the normal as well. Then the roughness can simply just be plugged into the roughness. And finally, normal map, we just need to press Shift A, then under vector, we'll choose normal map, plug your color into the color, and then plug your normal into the normal. And there we are. Now we've got our texture on our quad sphere. And if I zoom in here, you can see there is a little bit more pixelation than you will find for your UV sphere. Of course though, this can be reduced by increasing the texture size, such as increasing it to maybe a 4K texture. But I do feel like the UV sphere has the best value for texture space, if you like. So I tend to always go for the UV sphere for texture baking when possible. But yeah, that pretty much covers the basics of how we can go about texture baking onto UV spheres and quad spheres. Both options do require a UV sphere if you're using something like tile procedural material or brick procedural material, because they use, if I come to my tile shader here and click the node tree, you can see they are using this brick texture here, which is one of Blender's only procedural 2D textures, and they require a proper UV in order to work properly. Of course, if you're using something like maybe a procedural wood texture, you wouldn't need to do that whole selected to active nonsense. Instead, you could probably just go ahead and just bake it straight onto a smart UV project onto your quad sphere. So yeah, hopefully that clears up a few questions you have about baking onto spheres, but I imagine it may create a few more questions for you as well. So if you do have any, feel free to let me know. Apart from that though, I'd like to thank you for watching this installment in the course, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. So what about texture baking with metal materials? Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Blender Texture Baking Mastery. Today I'm going to be talking about baking metals and how we can go about doing that. So you can see here in this example that I've got an object here with two materials. So I've got a metallic material on one side and a non-metallic material on the other side. And I want to bake all of these onto one texture map. If I press tab to go into edit mode and press A to select everything, you can see that I just have a simple cube projection here. How I done that was I just pressed A to select everything, then I pressed U, and then I chose projection. And you can see that it got us this result here in my UV editor here. I'm just going to change this back to the outliner just now, and I'm actually just going to pull out a new window to get a UV editor. So I'll come to the top left hand corner and then I'll drag this out. If you want to follow along, I do have a blend file in the description of this course, so feel free to download that if you want to follow along. Then I'm going to change my 3D viewport here to the UV editor, so we've got a UV editor as well. Now, in the first place, why would we want a metal map? Well, this can be handy, especially when you're taking it into other software and you just want a simple texture to give your client, or maybe just to make it easier for yourself to easily plug it into the other software's native nodes. For example, when I was doing work for a client one time, I baked a metal map and then showed them how to plug it in to Unreal Engine, and having it all as just textures can make it a lot easier. So let's jump into how we can go ahead and bake all of these. So we'll get started with the stuff we know how to do, so the base color. And to do that, I'm just going to come to my material properties here, and you can see I've got my two material slots. So I've got my basic tiles and my gold metal tiles. So I'm going to come to my basic tiles first, press Shift A, and then in texture, I'm going to add an image texture, and I'll press plus new, and I'm going to call this diffuse half metal tiles. And I'll put 2K at the end as well, since we're going to make this a 2K texture. And then I'm going to left click and quickly drag down, and that's going to allow me to select both of these numbers. I can left click at the end here, hold down the shift key and type in the number 8, and that's going to give us a star. And then I can press 2, press enter, and now we've got 2048 by 2048, and I can just press new image, and now we've got a basic image to bake on. I'll keep it RGB since this is going to be the diffuse, and then I'm going to come up to my render properties here. I'm going to make sure I'm in cycles. We've already set up the issue with Blender 4.2, so we don't need to do any of those settings. And I'm going to set my max samples under render to 10, since it's just color we're doing. And I'm going to set my bake type to diffuse. Keep contributions direct and indirect off, since we don't want to bake any lighting from our scene. And we just want to have color, since that's just the basic color channel that we'll be baking that. As you know, if we left click this node tree here, when we bake the diffuse, it's going to be baking the base color of this principled BSDF, which is plugged into our surface. and it would be the same when we're baking the roughness. So I'll press the arrow to come back out, and what I'm going to do now is just left click my texture here, make sure I've got my object selected, make sure I've got all these settings the same, and I can just go ahead and press bake. And you'll notice that our bake is going to turn out like this. And this is actually going to cause some issues, because even if we got it so it was half-half, it would actually be impossible for us to apply it to this object as it is just now. So what we can do instead is we can use a second UV map and bake onto that instead. And that will help us solve our first problem. So to do that, it's actually very simple. We'll just come up to this green triangle here, and here where it says UV maps, you can just open this. You can press the plus button, and now this will allow us to create a second UV map. When I press tab to go into edit mode, you can see when we have it selected, it's going to show our UV map. So right now you can see it's just a duplicate of our other UV map. Notice how when I left between these, it's still the same. So I'll left click my second one, and then I'm just going to press A to select everything, U, and then we'll choose our Smart UV project. Keep your island margin at 0.01 and press unwrap. And now you can see we have our unwrap here. If you've scaled this object at all, make sure to apply the scale in object mode first. But since we haven't touched this will work just fine. You'll notice again now, if I left click my other UV map, it's going to toggle between the cube projection and this Smart UV project. And this Smart UV project will be more ideal for this bake. Now I'll go ahead and I'll left click my texture again, and then I'm going to come up to my render properties, scroll down, and I'm going to bake again. And it's not showing up in the UV editor here, but I can just drag this out and then I can choose it from here. And you can see that it's now baked it in only these areas, which is perfect, just what we're needing. And now we just need to bake the other part, which would be the gold part. So of course, because we've just done some baking, let's go ahead and save this image. So I'll press image and then I'll choose save, and I'm going to find a suitable location to save them, and then I'm just going to create a new folder called half metal tiles textures, and then I'll put in 2K afterwards, and I'm just going to double click that to open it, and then I'm just going to save as image. Then we'll come down to our material properties, and I'm going to switch to the gold metal tile slot, and then in here I'll press Shift A, then under texture I'll choose image texture, and then in this drop down here we just choose our diffuse half metal tiles again. Now something you'll find if we were to bake just now is going to just create black areas here, and that's because for some reason it doesn't seem to like the metallic slider. So whenever you encounter this issue when baking metals, all you need to do is left click this button here to go into the node tree, and this metallic slider we're just going to turn to 0. If I press tab to come into object mode, you'll notice that even though we've changed the slider to 0, it's still looking metallic. That's because I've set the IOR to gold, so even when we have metallic off, it's still going to kind of create the reflections that a gold material would have. So even though it's not looking yellow, don't worry, it will look yellow in the texture. And all I need to do now is come up by pressing this arrow if you haven't already, and then I can left click my texture, make sure I've got my object selected, come up to my render properties, scroll down to bake, and then just choose bake again. Awesome, and now you can see we've got the yellow tiles here as well for our gold. And then what we can do is we can just left click image and we can choose save, and that's just going to go ahead and override the last time we saved this texture, so it'll have all of our changes added. And great, that has now done the base color. Let's go ahead and move on to the roughness. So I'm going to come to my material properties, and then I'm going to come back to my basic tile slot. I'll left click this texture here and press Shift D to duplicate it. Then I'll press the X to remove its texture so I can add a new one, and then I'll press plus new, and I'm going to call this one roughness half metal tiles 2K. Then my width and height I'll keep at 2K, and then I'm just going to go ahead and press new image. Now I'm just going to go ahead and change the color space of this roughness to non-color. Now just before we bake our roughness here, we have to do something in the other material slot. So I'm going to come to my material properties, to gold metal tiles, and this we are actually going to have to get rid of it. So I'm going to left click it and then press X, because if we were to bake the roughness, it's going to override our diffuse map because it's the active selected thing in this gold metal tiles material. So for peace of mind, I usually just delete it, and then I'll come back to my basic tiles again, and we can also delete this one here too since we're finished with it for now. And then I can left click this roughness here, scroll down to the bottom, change the bake type to roughness, and then we can go ahead and left click bake. And now you can see it's gone ahead and baked the roughness of the non-metal side with all these nice imperfections here. Now all we need to do is we can come to our material properties, the gold metal tiles, and I'm just going to press Shift A, then under texture I'm going to choose image texture, and I'm going to left click this drop down and choose the roughness, and then we can come back to render properties, down to the bottom, make sure we have our object and our texture selected, and then just press bake. Awesome, and now you can see it's baked the roughness of this one here as well, and we now have a completed this map. So I can just go ahead and left click image, choose save, and then in my file browser I can just save it alongside my diffuse map by just pressing save as image. Then, like I done with the diffuse, I'm going to go ahead and delete these textures first. So I'll just left click this one and press X, and then I'm going to come back to my material properties, scroll up to the top, select basic tiles, and then I'm going to press X to remove this roughness one here, and I'm going to press plus new, and I'm going to call this one OpenGL normal half metal tiles. And I'm going to keep the resolution at 2K, and then just choose new image, and I'll change my color space here to non-color. Even though it's a normal map, we gotta make sure it's non-color. And then I'm just going to left click it to select it, make sure I've got my object selected, then I'll come to my render properties, scroll down, and change my bake type from roughness to normal. Then I'll make sure all these settings are the same, and then I'm going to go ahead and press bake. Awesome, and now you can see it's baked half of our object here. And now all we need to do is left click this material properties, come up to the gold metal tiles, and we'll just press Shift A again. Then under texture, I'll choose image texture, left click the drop down, and I'll choose the OpenGL normal half metal tiles. Then I'll left click the texture to select it, make sure I've still got my object selected, and then I'm going to come to my render properties, scroll down, and then make sure we're still on normal, and then we can just choose bake again. Perfect, and now we have a complete normal setup. So I can just go ahead and save this, so I'll left click image, and then I'll choose save. Then in my file browser, I'll just choose save as image here, and now that should be it saved. And then we're just going to do the same thing again. I'll left click my image here, and press X to delete the node. Then I'll come to my material properties, basic tiles, and here I'm just going to press the X, and this time I'm going to press plus new, and I'm going to call it metal half metal tiles, and then press new image, and I'll set my color space to non-color. Now all we need to do is go into our basic tile shader, and we're going to come to just this principled BSDF node. To bake the metal, we're just going to use the emission. So this is really simple. You can see here the metallic slider here is 0 for our non-metal shader. So all I need to do is left click my color, and here we're going to want to make sure the value slider is 0, and all of these ones are also 0 too. And that's it. All we'll need to do then is come back up, left click this, and then we'll come to our render properties, scroll down to the bottom, and I'm going to set my bake type here to emit, and then I'm just going to left click bake, and as we expected, it's going to create just a plain black texture, pretty much just the default. And then we can go ahead and go to our material properties, left click our gold metal tile slot, press Shift A, then under texture I'll choose image texture, then in this drop down I'm going to choose metal half metal tiles, then I'm going to go into my node tree again, and under emission we can set our strength here to 1, so make sure that's set to 1, and the color, we're just going to want to make sure the value is set to 1, which would match the usual metallic value of 1, which we've got turned off temporarily. Also, another thing to mention, if you had something plugged into the metal slot here, you would just plug that into the color. So just to make that clear, I'm then going to press the up button here, left click my metal tiles texture, come up to my render properties, scroll down to the bottom, and then just left click bake. Awesome, and now you can see we've got the white areas for where it's supposed to be metallic. We'll just go ahead and fix this shader now, so I'll go into the node tree again, and I'm going to change my strength here of my shader to 0, or you can just change your color here to 0 as well, and that will also work. Then we'll change our metallic value back to 1, and now it's all working again. I'll go up, and now I'm just going to save this metal map, so I'll just left click image, save, then in my file browser I can just save it here as my metal tiles texture. And now let's go ahead and give these materials a try. So I'm going to left click my object here, press Shift D, and then G and Y to move it along, and then I'm going to left click the X to remove the material, and then I'll come to my material properties, and I'm going to left click this minus button to remove all of the materials, and then we can just press plus new, and then I'm going to left click the material.001 and just call it half metal tiles bake. Now to get started with setting this up, all we need to do is press Shift A, and then under texture I'm going to choose image texture, and here I can just choose my diffuse from my drop down here. Do keep in mind that if you can't find it here, you can press the open button instead, and then just choose it from your file browser. Then I'm going to press Shift A, and then under input I'm going to choose UV map, and then I'm going to press Shift A again, and then under input I'm going to choose texture coordinate as well. Then I'm going to just plug in the UV into the vector and color into the base color. Right now you can see that it's not working properly, and that's because it's using the other UV. Remember how if I come to my green triangle here and come to my UV maps, we've got 2 UV maps, it's still using the default UV map. Now there's 2 ways we can go about this. We can keep both UV maps of this object and just select it using the UV map node, So to do that, all I would do is choose my UV map.001, which is the second UV map, and plug it into the vector, and you can see that that's now working. Or alternatively, we can just remove the first UV map here by selecting it and pressing minus, and then plugging in the UV of our texture coordinate into the vector. And that will work since it's now the only UV map. I can press Ctrl Z to undo that. Another thing we can do is we can left click the camera button beside the UV map.001, and that will now make it the default UV map, which means when I plug in my UV of my texture coordinate into the vector, it will now work as well. So a couple of different ways to go about doing that. Then I'll left click my texture here and press Shift D to duplicate, and I'm going to choose from the drop down here the roughness, and I'll plug the UV into the vector, make sure my color space is non-color, and plug my color into the roughness. And now we've got some nice reflective tiles again, but we still don't have the metallic side here. So to fix that, we can just press Shift D again to duplicate this selected texture. I'll zoom in and I'm going to change it by left clicking the drop down and choosing the metal. And then I'll plug in that vector to the UV here and then plug the color into the metallic. And now you can see it's working nicely, and we've got our metal and non-metal side all in this one set of textures. Of course, we can add our normal map as well, so I'll just left click this one here, press Shift D, then in the drop down, I'm going to choose the normal map here, plug in my vector to the UV, and I'll press Shift A, and then under vector, I'm going to choose normal map, plug your color into the color, and then normal into the normal. This normal map allows Blender to convert this texture into normal data. And now you can see we've got the result we were looking for. So yeah, great job. That just about covers it. This one had a lot of back and forth going on, but congratulations for making your way through the whole lesson. Feel free to share your results in the community, as I'd love to see how you got on with this one. Apart from that though, thank you so much for watching this module, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Ambient occlusion is awesome. So today, let's learn how to use it with texture baking. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Texture Baking Mastery. Today we're going to be baking some texture maps for this object I made here, and we're also going to be baking an ambient occlusion map, and then I'm going to show you how to use all those maps in conjunction with each other to create some really cool results. So to get started, let's left click our object here. Of course, to follow along, you can just use the file in the description of this module, so just left click that to download it, and then if you unzip it, you'll be able to open up this file here. To get started, we'll bake the base color. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture, and I'm going to press plus new, and then I'm just going to call it diffuse brick. And I'm going to make it a 2K texture. So I'm just going to left click and then quickly drag down. Then I'll left click the last bit here, and then I'm going to hold down Shift and type the number 8 to get a star sign, then 2, and then press enter. And that's going to perform a timesing operation and times that by 2, creating the number 2048. And then I can just go ahead and press new image. Then we're going to keep our color space on sRGB, since this is going to be the base color texture. Now, a little bit about this object here. If I press tab to go into edit mode, what I've done here, as some of you might have noticed, is a cube projection. So to get this result, all I done was I pressed U, and then I chose cube projection. And that's allowed us to place this procedural material on it nicely. However, this won't really work for texture baking. The main reason why is because the ambient occlusion relies a lot on the structure of the object, and so it's best for all of the faces to be separated out. So although some of the texture bakes will work, the ambient occlusion one will not. So for that reason, we're going to bake onto a different UV map, which might be less optimal for the base color, roughness, and normal map, but it'll be more optimal for the ambient occlusion. Of course though, if you really wanted to maximize, you could just bake onto the cube projection for the base color, roughness, and normal map, and use the other UV map for the ambient occlusion. However, I don't think all 3D software support 2 UV maps, so this might be something you'll only be able to do inside of Blender. So it really depends on your project's needs. For simplicity's sake though, we will just do it all onto a second UV map. So if I come to this green triangle here, we will need to preserve this UV map here, as we need this in order to tell Blender how our brick material looks. So I'm going to press the plus button to add a second UV map, and I'm going to then left click it to make sure it's blue like this. Then I can press tab to go into edit mode in the 3D viewport. I'll press A to select everything, then I'll press U, and then I'll choose Smart UV Project. Make sure all these settings are the same, including the island margin of 0.01, and then I'll just choose Unwrap. If I zoom in here, this is the unwrap we've been given, and you can see this will give us plenty of space for us to get some ambient occlusion in here. Then I'm going to keep it selected, and then if I come to my render properties, I'll make sure I'm in cycles, and I'll set my max samples to 10 since we're not doing any ambient occlusion yet. And then I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and make sure my bake type is set to diffuse. Turn off the direct and indirect since we don't want any lighting. And then I'll just go ahead and press bake. Awesome, and once we're finished here, we should have a result like this. Since everything is a little bit smaller, if you're wanting to go for really high detail, 4K texture maps may be a better option for you. But for now, I'm just going to keep it on 2K. Then I'm going to left click my texture here and press Shift D to duplicate. And I'm going to press the cross to get rid of this. And then I'll press plus new. And this one I'm going to call roughness brick. And then I'm going to press new image and change it from color space to non-color. Also, we need to save our base color image. So I'm going to come up to where it says image with a star beside it, left click it, and then I'm going to choose save. Then in my file browser here, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm just going to call it brick 2K textures. And since this is the second time we're making brick textures in this folder, I'm just going to put 2 after it since it's the second one. Then I'm just going to double click it to open it, and then I'll just choose save as image here. Then I'm going to left click my roughness brick texture and I'm going to scroll down to my bake settings here and change my bake type to roughness. Then I can go ahead, make sure my settings are the same, make sure my objects are selected and my roughness brick texture, and then just press bake. Awesome, now we have our roughness image. We can just go ahead and left click image and then choose save. And then in my folder here, I'm just going to press save as image. Then now we'll go ahead and do the normal. So I'll just left click this roughness brick here and I'll press Shift D to duplicate. Then I'll press X to remove it from here, plus new, and I'm just going to call this OpenGL normal brick. I'll keep my width and height at 2K, and then I'm just going to press new image, and I'll change my color space here to non-color. Then we can go ahead and change our bake type here to normal, and then we can go ahead and press bake. Awesome, and now we have our normal map, so we can go ahead and left click image and then choose save. And then I'm just going to press save as image inside my file browser. And there, now we have our base textures. Let's go ahead and do the ambient occlusion. So I'm going to change my bake type here from normal to ambient occlusion. And of course we need the texture to bake onto. So I'll just left click one of these and press Shift D to duplicate. And I'll press the X to get rid of it, press plus new, and I'm going to call this AO brick. I'll keep it at 2K, and then I'm going to press new image, and I'm going to change the color space here to non-color. Then I'm going to come up to the top here, and for my max samples here, I'm just going to set it to something higher, like 100, as it will need a bit more of a lighting calculation for ambient occlusion. However, if you're not satisfied with the result, I recommend setting it to something higher. You can also keep the noise threshold and denoise on to improve the result a little bit. Then I'll scroll down, and I'm just going to left click bake. Great, and when it's done, it should look something like this. And so we can just go ahead and save this. So I'll left click image and I'll choose save as or save. And then I'm just going to go ahead and press save as image in my file browser. And awesome, now we have all of our image textures. And now I'll show you how we can actually use them. So I'll left click my object here and press Shift D to duplicate. Then I'm going to press G and X and then pull this along. Since we got all our textures in here already, I'm just going to left click this button here, this add a new material thing, which actually just duplicates this material. And then I can just left click this big shader and press X. And we still need a shader, so I'm just going to press Shift A, and then under shader, I'm going to choose Principled BSDF, which is this default shader here, and also the best shader in my opinion. And I'm going to plug the BSDF into the surface, and then we can start plugging these in. So to get started, let's take the diffuse brick, and if I press Shift A, and then under input, I'll choose texture coordinate, so we can use the UV coordinates, and I'll plug UV into vector, and then color into base color. And you'll see right now it's going to be using the other UV. So what we can do is we can come to our green triangle and we can either left click this camera here to use the other UV map, or for simplicity's sake we can just remove the other one. So this is the cube projection one on top. I'll just left click the minus and that's gotten rid of it. Next up we have the roughness, so I'll plug the UV into the vector of this one and then I'll plug this color into the roughness. Then we have our OpenGL normal map, so I'll just drag this down here and I'm going to plug the UV into the vector here, and then we need to use a normal map node in order to use this normal map with our shader. So I'll press Shift A, then under vector I'll choose normal map and I'll plug my color into the color and then normal all the way into the normal socket. And awesome, now we have our basic brick PBR textures applied. Let's talk about how we can actually use this ambient occlusion one. So first of all, I'll take my UV coordinates and plug it into the vector, and then I'm going to left click and drag it to just pull it up here, as we're going to be combining it into the base color. So we have a couple of options. We can either use this as a mask or we can use it as a multiply. So the first way I'm going to show you is the mask method. So I'll press Shift A and then under color, I'm going to choose mix color. And then I'm just going to left click this here for now. And if you've watched my masks and mixing nodes video, you'll know that we can use black and white textures, such as this one here, to control what goes in this A and B socket of our mix node. So if you don't know what masks are, I highly recommend watching that video, as it's kind of essential to understand what we're talking about here. I'll leave that linked in the resources section of this module. I'll then plug the color into the factor, and now what we can do is If I drag my result into the surface to see what it looks like, we can now use these two colors to control what our ambient occlusion looks like. So B is going to represent the white areas here, and A is going to represent the more darker areas. So if I want to make the darker areas darker, I can left click the A color and bring down the slider, and you can see how that's making the darker areas darker like that. So that's the basics of how it works, but how do we use it with our base color? Well, what I like to do is I'll plug my color into A of my diffuse brick, and then I'll also plug it into the B socket as well. That will then reset it to the default. And then what we can do is we can press Shift A, then under color I can choose hue saturation value, and I can plug that in between the A. The reason I'm choosing A is because I want to make this part darker using this hue saturation value node. So this node will allow me to adjust the value. So value is brightness. So if I decrease this, it's going to make it darker. And so if I set this down to something like 0, you can see how this is really enhancing the level of detail we have here. To show you before and after, I'll just set this value back to 1, which is the default, and you can really see a difference now. Like I mentioned, that's not the only method, so what I'll do is I'll left click my mix node and press Shift D, and this method is using the multiply. So we can change this from mix here to multiply, and then what I can do, if I plug my diffuse brick into the A socket, and then I'll plug my AO into the B socket, you'll now notice when I put this to 0, and then I'll plug my result into the surface, you'll notice we have our plain diffuse texture, and as I increase the factor higher and higher, you can see it's going to bring more of our ambient occlusion in, like that. Both of these methods are pretty good, and which one you prefer is really up to you. For now, I'm just going to get rid of the other method, so I'll just left click this mix node here, and then shift left click this hue saturation value node, and then press X to delete them. And now we can go ahead and plug this into our shader. So I'm going to plug my result into the base color, and then I'm going to plug my BSDF into the surface. And there, now we have our result, and you can notice how this looks a lot more intense. It can be great for really adding some extra character to your models. I'm maybe going to set my factor though to something a little bit lower, like 0.7. There, that looks pretty good. And yeah, that just about covers it. I hope you enjoyed this module. Feel free to share your results in the community if you'd like to, as I'd love to see how you got on with this module. Apart from that though, I'd like to thank you so much for watching this module, and I'll see you later. Take care.